Hello my dear friends, you're on the Military Summary channel. In this video we're going to discuss the most important events that took place during the previous 12 hours. We have lots of very interesting updates, so let's start. And first we're going to talk about Moscow, where according to information we have, yesterday in the evening the negotiation process between the Russian Federation and the United States of America ended. In this video we can see how the US Special Representative Steve Witkoff was leaving the territory of the Russian Federation, the territory of Moscow. Witkoff spent just over 12 hours in Moscow and also spent an hour at the embassy of the United States of America, where most likely he was talking with the President of the United States, Donald Trump. As for now, no results of the meeting have been reported yet. Now let's discuss in details everything that been taking place during all this situation, during this negotiation process, and let's discuss several statements made by Putin himself. So Putin's main statements after talks with Lukashenko, who also was on the territory of Moscow yesterday. Moscow agrees with the proposal to stop the special military operation to stop this war in Ukraine, agrees with the idea of a ceasefire, but there are some nuances. It is unclear who will give orders to stop hostilities in Ukraine and what their price will be. I believe that by this statement Putin first of all was trying to tell Zelensky and the United States of America that currently there are a lot of groups of forces in Ukraine like Azov Battalion, Azov Brigade and many other nationalist brigade who will never follow orders and who will continue this war and this special military operation. Ukraine can use a temporary cessation, ceasefire for forced mobilization and weapons supplies. It is necessary to decide how to control this. Another important thing, because the United States of America, for example, recently said that they will continue supporting Ukraine with weapons, and which obviously during this 30 days period will just reinforce Ukraine, will rearm Ukraine, and obviously in the months Ukraine will be completely much more powerful than Ukraine right now, after the complete defeat, for example, in the Sumy direction. The cessation of hostilities should lead to long-term peace and the elimination of the root causes of the crisis. We are talking about Ukraine attempts to join NATO, the European Union, and many other things. Russia will negotiate the next steps to the end the conflict based on the situation on the ground. This is also very important situation, because the Russians are not going to stop their offensive. They're going to continue, and obviously during the next months the Russians will take more and more territories of Ukraine under control, and the Russians are trying to tell us that by the time their signature is being put by the Russians and the Ukrainians, the territories that are currently by the time under Russian control will be included in the territory of the Russian Federation. The group of Ukrainian militants that invaded the Kursk border area is completely isolated. The Ukrainian servicemen blocked in the Kursk region will have a choice to surrender or die. That was stated by Putin. And by the way, another important thing that was stated by the Russian side is that the Russians are planning to increase significantly the number of investigators on the territory of the Kursk region, because the Russians reported that they have already recorded tens cases of military of war crimes committed by the Ukrainians, and obviously this number is going to grow, and obviously the Russians are going to use this situation also as the reason to continue the special military operation until they get at least those who were responsible for all those war crimes. So all these things were stated by the Russians during the day. And another important thing is that in the end of all these talks, at the end of this negotiation process with the president of Belarus, Putin thanked Trump for his efforts to settle the situation in Ukraine, and then he declined that the ceasefire offer and suggested to talk about the details of possible solution. He declined this ceasefire, and later we start receiving additional reports from the United States of America. For example, Trump administration imposes additional restrictions on Russia's oil and gas sectors. In addition, the US did not extend the license for Russian banks that conducted energy trading operations as an exception. Now all transactions are prohibited under the current sanctions. This will mean a significant increase in sanctions pressure on the Kremlin. Putin rejected the ceasefire proposal agreed by the US. He offers is an alternative that contradicts the first option. They also write that Putin wants to remove Ukraine from the negotiations so that the Russian Federation can negotiate with the US itself. It seems that this refusal was the reason for the straightening of sanctions. So we see that Putin rejected this ceasefire, and the United States of America, as was promised, increased their sanctions and sanctions restrictions. So this is the situation, which means that the special military operation will continue and the war will continue, and we start receiving additional updates from the territory of Sumy direction. But currently I believe that it's time to call this area not as a Sumy direction, but from now on this is already the Sumy direction, because for example today the Ukrainian authorities have announced the evacuation of the population from 8 settlements in the Sumy region on the border with Russia, where units of the Russian armed forces are conducting an offensive operation. For example, and the most important, the Ukrainians are planning to evacuate the people and civilians from the village by the name of Yunakievka, and also the Ukrainians have announced that they are going to evacuate people from the settlement by the name of Miropolye. And these are the nearest villages where the Russians are advancing. For example, today, according to different geolocations that were provided by the Ukrainian side, the Russians during the previous 24 hours managed to improve their positions and to get to the outskirts of the settlement by the name of Alexandria. The video was published by the Ukrainian side. In this video we can see how the Ukrainians from the Sumy region were attacking and bombing the Russian vehicles, Russian convoys that were heading towards the settlement of Miropolye. The Russians suffered losses because the Ukrainians prepared their defense in this part, so it's not going to be so easy for the Russians to move in this area as it was very easy in the vicinity of Sumy. Anyway, the Russians improved their positions and most likely they will try to answer this village itself. Furthermore, according to information we have, the Russians managed to improve their positions in the area of Basovka, and this information was confirmed by pro-Ukrainian sources as well. Furthermore, the Russians continued their offensive operation on the territory of the Russian Federation, and during the previous 24 hours the Russians managed to improve their position significantly. As you can see, currently the Russians from the area of Kurilovka, Milovoy are trying to advance further towards the village of Aleshnya. The Russians by this attack are trying to cut the Ukrainians from supplying support. We're talking about not thousands of Ukrainians, but the last hundreds of Ukrainians who are still on the territory of Gogolivka, in these fields, in these tree lines. So the Russians are trying to take this village under control and to cut these Ukrainians from evacuation. Obviously, by this attack, the Russians will be able probably to capture maybe 100 or 200 of Ukrainians who are still located in this area. Furthermore, according to information we have, the Russians left the territory of the Sumy agglomeration, and the Russians managed to secure by the morning of the 14th of March of 2025 the settlement of Rubanshina. So currently, in summarizing everything, there are just 4 settlements left under complete Ukrainian control, but it's just a matter of one day. Obviously, we're talking about the village of Gogolivka, the village of Aleshnya, the village of Guyeva, and the village of Garnal. Probably these 2 villages, Aleshnya and Gogolivka, would be taken by the Russians during the next day, during this day. But when talking about Guyeva and when talking about Garnal, obviously the clashes here are going to be very difficult for the Russians, because this territory was reinforced by the Ukrainians significantly. We're not saying that the Russians are not able to take these territories under complete control, we're just saying that it will take time. Also, the Russians continue publishing different videos from different parts of Sumy and Sumy agglomeration, how the Russians were taking the territories under complete control. For example, in this video we can see the convoy that was ambushed by the Russians during the first day of pipeline offensive operation. If you remember, we were talking a lot about this operation when the Ukrainians were trying to evacuate their servicemen and their vehicles, but they were stuck between 2 destroyed bridges, and then the Russians began bombing and attacking this territory with FPV drones, artillery, and these are the consequences of that attack. Lots of destroyed vehicles, basically the place of the cemetery for those Ukrainians that were stuck there. Furthermore, the Russians continue evacuation process, and the most important, once again, the Russians are planning to increase the number of investigators, because the Ukrainians for the previous 6-7 months managed to commit the significant number of war crimes, and now the Russians will investigate every single one of them. Now let's move further and let's discuss the situation in the Slavyansk direction, the Sivers direction. During the previous 24 hours, we got very important video. I'll remind you that since the beginning of March, this direction is very active because the Russians published lots of very important updates. For example, the Russians reported that during the March, that the Russians, as a result of offensive operation, managed to improve their positions in the vicinity of Orekhovo-Vasilievka. Furthermore, the Russians during the same months during the March reported that they managed to establish complete control over the settlement by the name of Novomarkova. And today, by the morning of the 14th of March of 2025, we got another video from the settlement of Vasyukovka. And in this video, by the way, Russian control over the settlement, over some part of the settlement, was also confirmed by neutral mappers. In this video, we can see how the Russians carried out another offensive operation on the positions of the armored forces of Ukraine. The Russians used a significant number of vehicles, they built convoy, and they began offensive operation. The Ukrainians managed to discover the movements of the Russian side, of the Russian units, and then the Ukrainians began bombing and attacking the Russian forces. But at the end of everything, at the end of this operation, we see that the Russians, the armed forces of Russian Federation, managed to cross these fields and to land infantry in the eastern part of the settlement by the name of Vasyukovka. So this territory was captured by the Russians, and the main purpose of this attack carried out by the Russians was to cut the settlement of Vasyukovka in two, because there is a river of Vasyukovka and there is the eastern part of the village and the western part. So now the eastern part of the village was cut from supply and support, and we expect that if the Russians are able to dig in deeper in this part of Vasyukovka, we should expect another wave of attack, but this time the Russians would try to take under control this part of the village. If the Russians are able to take this territory under complete control, then the Russians will be able to cross the river of Vasyukovka and to begin offensive operation in the northern direction with the purpose to attack the settlement of Sivers from the south and from the southwest. Now let's move further and let's discuss the situation in the city of Toretsk, where both the Russians and the Ukrainians continue their attacks or counter-attacks. According to neutral mappers, the Ukrainians during the previous 24 hours managed to improve their positions and to take additional block in the Zabalka micro-district. So as you can see, the Ukrainians are not planning to stop, they continue their offensive operation, and these are the changes on the ground during the previous 24 hours. Furthermore, the Russians from their side continue improving their positions in the northern part of the city of Toretsk, and the Russians managed to restore control over the most northern part of the settlement. Based on this video published by the Ukrainian side, we have adjusted the map back in the Russian favor, but there are still lots of islands and pockets of resistance from the Ukrainian side, and obviously now we believe that it will take at least 1 or 2 months before the Russians will be able to stabilize the situation completely and to force the Ukrainians to fall back. Furthermore, we started receiving the first geolocations that confirm Russian control over the most northern part of the mine of Toretsk mine. So the clashes in this area continue. Now let's move further. Let's discuss the situation in the Pokrovsk direction. Today we got the video that confirms Russian control and the Russian presence in the settlement by the name of Kotlina. I'll remind you that several days ago, several pro-Ukrainian sources reported that they managed to restore control over this village completely, and we have adjusted the map as a contested area, but now we have enough of proofs that confirm Russian control at least over the southwestern part. Very interesting updates and details we continue receiving from the territory of Shevchenka. There are very heavy clashes, and this morning we got a video where we can see how the Russians were after withdrawing those Ukrainians that were counter-attacking the Russian units in the southern part of the settlement. During the day, lots of mappers adjusted their maps in the Ukrainian favor, and we can see some pro-Russian resources shows and draw areas like this, something like this, but also right before we start making the video, several sources reported that the Russians counter-attacked and managed to restore control over the southern part. As for now, without any proofs and geolocations, so let's wait a bit, maybe we will adjust the map during the day back in the Russian favor. Furthermore, according to information we have, the Russians counter-attack in the area of Uspenovka managed to take under control or return under control the central part. So this village is very difficult battlefield, and sometimes the village of Uspenovka changes its owner several times a day. Now let's move further. Let's discuss the situation in the Zaporizhzhia direction, where the Russians also continue their offensive operation, or not continue, where the Russians began their offensive operation, and we have several changes on the ground in the Russian favor. If you remember, yesterday we talked that the Russians began offensive, that they managed to answered the settlement by the name of Mala Sherbaki, and today this information was also confirmed by neutral mappers. So the Russians are planning to do something here, very interesting situation, so let's wait and see what is going to be next. But obviously this offensive operation can have just one task, one purpose: to take the settlement of Orekhov and Kamyansk and the complete control, to break through the Ukraine defense belt and to begin advancing from the Russian side in the direction of the city of Zaporizhzhia. And that's it for the short video. Military with Summary channel reminds we condemn any violence in the world. Thank you for your watching. Subscribe to my channel, put your likes, join my Patreon, and have a good day. Bye bye.